All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. All right. This is the History Happy Hour, and my name is John Kennedy. I'm the Specialist of Education and Engagement at the Indiana Historical Society, and it is so great to have you here this evening. Tonight, we're going to be discussing about Hispanic influence on Northern Indiana with our guest, Emiliano Aguilar. Emiliano is the PhD candidate in history at Northwestern University, and he is a native of East Chicago, Indiana, where he attended Wabash College in Crawfordsville, Indiana, and majored in English and history. Our moderator tonight is Nicole Martinez-LeGrand, who is our multicultural collections curator. Thank you both for joining us. Before I get over to the conversation, it's just a few pieces of logistics that I have to cover. So here at Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana Storyteller, connecting people to the past. We collect paper-based items such as books, paintings, and other collections to help tell Indiana's unique stories. We then find ways to share these stories through publications, exhibits, and events such as this one. Through these documents, we tell the diverse stories of Indiana and inspire a future grounded in our state's uniting values and principles. For our event, Nicole and our guests will talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. If you have any questions as we go along, please drop it in the question and answer section at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll keep an eye on them and then pepper them in as we get to the second half of the program. If you would like to add anything to the chat box, don't forget to change your response to all panelists and attendees so that we can all see your thoughts. And then keep an eye on our chat where we will be dropping in links and URLs throughout the conversation. Don't worry if you miss one, they will be delivered to your inbox in a follow-up email tomorrow morning. This program is being recorded, and you can catch the replay on our website at indianahistory.org in the upcoming weeks. And if you enjoy this program, please consider coming back for more. Our next History Happy Hour is May 12th, where we will talk with IHS's own Director of Access and Preservation, Susan Sutton. We will be discussing the Hoosier Motorist Collection. You can sign up for that and our other programs at indianahistory.org. All right, Nicole, take it away.
All right. Hi, welcome everybody. Again, my name is Nicole. I am the Multicultural Collections Curator here at the Indiana Historical Society. I am very excited to speak with Emiliano today. We both have Northwest Indiana roots. We are both Latino, Hispanic. And so this is a real treat for me. So Emiliano, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you all so much for the invitation. This is great. I'm so glad, of all the moderators, it's you moderating this. A lot of shared interest about our hometown and Latino history of the state of Indiana.
So we are talking about the Concerned Latins organization. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the CLO? Who started it? When did it start? And why do you think it started?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Concerned Lands organization was an affiliate to the Saul Alinsky Institute, later the Industrial Areas Foundation, based out of Chicago. And it's a coalition of almost 3 dozen, or was a coalition of almost 3 dozen neighborhood, political, and labor organizations. I mean, this ranged from everything from the Boy Scouts to Brown Berets to the Youth Advisory Board, which was one of the early civil rights organizations in the community, that just all shared a common identifying characteristic that they consider themselves Latins, predominantly ethnic Mexicans and Puerto Ricans. And they started in the mid-70s, 73, when they signed the contract with the Industrial Areas Foundation, because of this sort of attention to a lot of what they viewed as discrimination against ethnic Mexicans and Puerto Ricans within the community. For context, at this time, East Chicago in the late 60s is starting to undergo new redevelopment civil service projects throughout the city. And a lot of the community was upset that the 6th district, where a lot of the ethnic Mexicans and Puerto Ricans lived, was not getting a recreation center. So that one of the earliest sort of civil rights movements was a march on City Hall, really questioning why they were excluded from these sort of civic improvements to the city. And then there's things like in 1970, the Washington High School walkout over an alleged comment by a school administrator that supposedly said that Mexicans were lazy and ignorant. And it starts this 600 student walkout and month-long protest of parents calling their students in sick, students walking out of their classrooms, students occupying the superintendent's offices. So there's quite a bit of sort of activism that's entering into the late 60s, early 70s, that I believe the Concerned Lands organization, I mean, many of their members were a part of, felt became a catalyst for further action.
So you talk about the 6th district. So two things. So for our viewers at home, East Chicago is in Northwest Indiana, just kind of what we'd say a stone's throw away from Chicago. And so Chicago, I mean, what about like 20, 25 miles between the two. So not very far away. Also, so tell us about the 6th district. So East Chicago, the city of East Chicago is the Twin Cities. So you have East Chicago proper, and Indiana Harbor. So where was the sixth district?
Absolutely. So the 6th district was in the Indiana Harbor, eastern section of the city, predominantly immigrant community, very close to a lot of the heavily industrialized areas. And the 6th district, where most of the ethnic Mexicans and later Puerto Ricans lived, we're talking stone throw from Chicago, like they were in the shadow of the steel mills. And that's essentially what brought a lot of not only the ethnic European immigrant communities to the region, but ethnic Mexicans in the 1910s, 1920s. Again, in the 1960s, my paternal grandfather came in the 1960s wave, and then the 1950s with Puerto Ricans arriving to work in the steel mills in these areas. And because of residential segregation at the time in East Chicago, they were really confined to this sort of 1 square mile radius. In the 1930s, Paul S. Taylor, who's this academic out of the University of California network, notes that it's actually the most densest concentration of ethnic Mexicans in the entire United States, like more dense than any part of LA or the Rio Grande Valley region, which is, I think, so fascinating to think of. And it's not till the 60s and 70s where we start to see more of the hyper concentration within that original neighborhood just spread out into neighboring blocks and areas of the Indiana Harbor neighborhoods.
So pre 1960s, 1970s, a lot of the ethnic Mexicans, you mentioned industrial communities, really formed outside of gate number 1 of Inland Steel Company, which is now called Cleveland Cliffs, in the Block and Pensy neighborhood, which was largely upended by urban renewal, specifically urban renewal project number 1. So that was in the 1960s. And then do you feel like the CLO, the Concerned Latins organization, was kind of pushed by that, I guess, that disenfranchisement by the effects of urban renewal project number 1?
Absolutely. I mean, you have members of these that headed these committees within the Concerned Lands organization that were self-described like Block and Pensy guys. They grew up in this neighborhood, and then because of urban renewal project number 1, left their childhood homes. I mean, more often with just a couple months notice, if that, moving to new parts of the harbor. So they live with those sort of like historical experiences. And then even much younger residents of CLO, much younger residents, of Block and Pensy that would become involved in CLO activism, like the VMPs, very mellow people.
I've not heard about them. They're too mellow, maybe. I don't know.
They might be a little too mellow. But a young, very like multiracial, essentially Black, ethnic Mexican, Puerto Rican. They describe themselves as a street gang, but they held like canned food drives after the urban renewal project, and did like a lot of local philanthropy work within the community as part of their sort of like activism against an urban renewal project and trying to build community and retain retain community from their Block and Pensy days into now these new streets, whether they're moving over to Fur or Pulaski a few blocks over, and really trying to retain a sense of the community.
So back to the CLO, there was a woman by the name of Irene Gonzalez, I believe, that you talked a little bit about her in some of your research. Can you tell us about Irene and her role with the CLO?
Yeah, Irene served as either, depending on the year, Concerned Lands organization, you should mention, was only around for about 6-ish years. So their time as an organization is relatively brief. And during that time, Irene Gonzalez served as the either chairperson in entirety or co-chaired with other members, predominantly like Carmelo Melendez and Eddie Egipacio. And what I know of Irene is actually great. When I interviewed with Carmelo Melendez, she has since passed. about a little over a decade, I believe, now at this point. Carmelo Melendez mentioned, like, she was barely 4 foot half tall, and she was the most scary, fierce person like you would ever meet. Like, and I think one of the neat pictures, actually, if we could show it, John, is Irene Gonzalez and a lot of the activists at Concerned Lands organization were so combative, is how the city council meeting show, but the city council had to put well, yes, thank you. This is
Wow.
her actually on the far left. This is before a march demanding a minority hiring policy, both to serve the urban renewal projects. A lot of the councilmen, particularly Jesse Gomez, who's the first elected ethnic Mexican councilman in the community, are upset that a lot of the construction jobs for these urban renewal projects are not going to ethnic Mexicans or Puerto Ricans. And then there's also the issue of like municipal employment. And why is it that in a city, particularly in 1970, at this point, is the 1970 census shows that East Chicago is split perfectly in thirds: a third ethnic European, a third Black, a third Hispanic, Latino. Why is it then that Latinos don't have equal access to municipal employment? So they marched demanding hiring policies. So she's here. Then a few more over, because of how combative and sort of the confrontational tactics that the Concerned Lands utilized, the city council actually installed a guardrail to separate themselves from the activists.
Oh, is that John, when you advance to the next slide?
Yes,
I think it's like the third slide. No, you're fine. These are some really great photos. And so where did you source all these photos? The next one over? There we go. Look at this guardrail to protect everybody from Miss Irene Gomez, or Doña Irene Gomez. No, not Gomez, Gonzalez. I'm so sorry. Yeah.
No, you're fine. Yeah, I mean, and this just, I really think speaks to the confrontational tactics of some of these members. Most of these are sourced through the Hammond Times, I believe, that I used here today. And the tactics themselves, I think, are just so interesting in how they're described by different organizations. So the Hammond Times and official municipal, like city council meeting minutes, always describe it as like the angry Latins, an outburst by these Latins. And then there's this sort of alternative press in the community, the Latin Times, that highlights like, well, no, this wasn't combative or angry at all. So-and-so just wanted to leave the petition at the council member's desk and they got defensive. Maybe they walked up angrily in the council person's eyes. Or the Land Times carrying an instance, I believe it was the second photo, when Governor Bowen arrives to discuss, actually, I'm blanking on what Governor Bowen was there to discuss, but the CLO utilizes an opportunity to protest the expenditures around the soon-to-be Washington Elementary School, which was supposed to be a $14 million project. It was one of the most extravagant budgeted schools in the community at the time. And the Land Times notes that Pastrick sends out essentially cops to beat the activists. And it creates
Mayor Pastrick was,
yes.
Wow.
Mayor Bob Pastrick utilized police officers to beat the activists shortly after, because they were there like yelling and making him essentially, like, according to Land Times again, making him look bad in front of the governor by having this huge protest at his speaking engagement. I believe it was at the Elks Lodge.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Wow. So I know that the CLO was very influential in terms of, advocacy. Can you talk about that advocacy with, city employment?
Yeah, so municipal employment was one of the three pillars that Concerned Latins organized themselves around: education, housing, and then employment. And I believe in employment, they've left the best historical record, as well as one of the most enduring legacies. They attached themselves, many of the Concerned Lands members, particularly John Gomez, were involved in this civil suit against the city over hiring. And a lot of it stems from that if you were a Latino or a Black resident who wanted to work as a police officer or a firefighter, you had to supposedly, allegedly, pay this exorbitant $300 physical exam fee, and then you had to pay your councilman. So a lot of these members that are part of this case called Dawson v. Pastrick, which is at the time for the U.S. District Court in this region, the longest suit in its kind, ending in the late 80s. Finally, like the docket stems from 71 to I believe 88, 89. So the Concerned Lands organization through John Gomez attached themselves to this struggle and really try to highlight, like, yes, why is it that, the city is a third Black and a third Latino, and there's barely even 15 firefighters on this force? And they really then target a lot of the issues they believed were at hand. The physical exam fee that they found to be outrageous, the sort of schedule for each week, 24 hours working, 48 hours off. And then they really wanted to target the fact that a lot of the firefighters at this time, the average time in seniority was 30-ish years. So in 1971, 30 years, most of the firefighters have been hired during World War II. And it's an aging department. So they really worked in these two dual struggles, the courtroom with Dawson v. Pastrick, and then as the activists and broader organization trying to get the community to pass an affirmative action hiring ordinance, which at this time is a struggle we see in communities not only across the state of Indiana, but across the country, really trying to gain entry into this new form of opportunity. Particularly because of deindustrialization as well. I mean, a lot of these people,
throughout the 80s and whatnot. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, East Chicago is zoned at its height 74, 76% industrial land. And already in the 70s, you're seeing in East Chicago smaller manufacturing plants like Edward Valve, no longer in production. And each of these, even these smaller ones, you're talking dozens, if not 100, 200 jobs that are now no longer around. And those sort of middle-class lifestyles that those workers have become accustomed to, how else are you going to get access to it if not through like this patronage network that the CLO activists wanted to target, and being municipal employment?
So you said the CLO, the Concerned Latins organization, only lasted for, a couple of years. I guess, would you say that technically is on paper or in terms of advocacy? What happened after it kind of disbanded?
Sure. So the Alinsky Institute sends an organizer for their affiliate organizations. And according to that organizer, Pete Martinez, a lot of the issue began to stem from members of the organization refusing to form a multiracial coalition. Martinez and the Alinsky Institute felt that there was no power in an all Latina organization, and that the only way for the group to remain viable was to become a multiracial working class organization. And so after several votes, members who did not agree with this sort of change walked out and left the organization. That's one. Some members argue that CLO dies out because it becomes sort of a cult of personality. Like it becomes something that gravitates around just these figureheads or these major leaders in the program. And then the other people, despite doing a lot of the heavy lifting, a lot of the organizing and activism, are sort of excluded. Whether that be excluded from the applause and the recognition of any successes, or excluded from policy making decisions. And then the third bit, I mean, yeah, Concerned Lands organization ends on paper, but I mean, there's dozens of more Latino organizations that form, especially from members of CLO. The Gomez's go on to start the Northsiders, a neighborhood organization that also doubles as like a political action committee. There's efforts by some members to get into the electoral ring. Concerned Lands organization activists are concerned with electoral politics, but then once the organization's gone, some of them decide, well, you know what, maybe I could fix things internally by entering into politics. And then there's organizations like Hispanics for Justice that really, I mean, they arrive in the 80s and are more focused on an issue that Concerned Lands didn't really target, and that's police brutality and sort of like in the carceral state. Yeah, so I think, yeah, those three things really lead to it. Cult of personality, the worries of whether or not to form a multiracial coalition, and then the third bit just being like a changing interest or sense of direction that some
Mhm.
members held.
Mhm. You did mention the 50th anniversary, or now the 51st anniversary of the walkout at Washington High School. I just would like our audience to know that Emiliano was a guest blogger for us last year, in which he posted a short blog about this history. If you would like to read more, our institutional blog is available on our website, www.indianahistory.org. So, but do you want to talk a little bit about the walkout? I mean, so that's just like a younger subset of activists, where it might be their parents who are the ones involved in the CLO. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the key figures of this walkout is Irene Gonzalez, who, along with Susan Roque, serves as guardians for these two young men whose families sent them ahead of them. They were migrant workers in Texas. They send their sons ahead of them, and through Our Lady of Guadalupe, the ethnic Mexican parish in the harbor, Susan and Irene agreed to be guardians of these young men and enroll them in school. And then supposedly through a mix-up of paperwork, school administrator Barron says, makes this alleged infamous comment that Mexicans are lazy and ignorant. And through meetings at Our Lady of Guadalupe, a lot of these high school students decide that this comment cannot stand and orchestrate a walkout. And the walkout only becomes sort of the catalyst for all these further actions I mentioned, such as what the newspaper labels the brown flu, parents pulling their students out. However, what really changes, and I think leads from like this younger generation leading a civil rights struggle like a walkout to now the parent activism, the Concerned Lands organization, where the threats of expulsion that went like, oh, the students that have walked out, the students that have occupied the superintendent's office now face the fear of being expelled from school. That, okay, the parents are like, okay, we've canceled the brown flu. You all will go to school. You all will attend classes, and we will take it from here. And then you really get now like one of the main organizations within this coalition of the CLO is the Youth Advisory Board, which Irene and Susan belong to. And they sort of then take the reins from there. However, the students are still very much centered in it. One of the other forms of activism that has a statewide impact is the push in East Chicago for bilingual education. I mean, this culminates in the bilingual education bill in the state of Indiana, which is, gosh, now I'm going to blank on the year, 76, I'm pretty sure. That is done and made possible because of activism by people like the Concerned Latins that have their children in mind and their children's education in mind. Carmelo Melendez, who's one of the co-chairmen, serves on the board that Governor Bowen establishes. And then there's sort of like this really neat bit. Governor Bowen says he fires Melendez. Melendez says he quits. And this all stems from when the police beat the activist during Governor Bowen's visit. Bowen's like, okay, I'm terminating Melendez because this is not what I expected from, a reputable, proper organization. Like they're acting like hooligans. And then Melendez is like, no, I quit. The moment they decided to stick the cops on us, I decided like I don't want anything to do with these politicians. And I think that's such a neat, interesting like moment to explore like how memory and like there's always the two sides of story.
Oh yeah, what gets published in the paper and what actually happened. Yes.
Yeah.
So I know that you've done a lot of research in this area. What would you say that Latin activism looks like now in East Chicago, or from like the 70s on? What would you say kind of like are the key points in recent and further back history?
Yeah, so it's been super interesting one to write. The bit I shared with you, I wrote this, and that'll be coming out in July. I started this as a project when I began my program 5 years ago. So to finally see it come into fruition. But as I was starting this was when East Chicago, Mayor Anthony Copeland and the Chicago Fire Department had their dispute over sort of, I mean, the firefighters union endorsing Copeland's opponent, and then Copeland allegedly using this as an opportunity to strike back, retaliate against the firefighters for a variety of reasons, right? Like changing the hour system, closing fire stations in the city, removing beds from their sleeping area. And I think that's super interesting of a parallel to see now, like that how contentious probably isn't the right word, but how central sort of like the municipal activism is still in East Chicago. And I think that's now though for a variety of different reasons, right? That in the 70s, a lot of these municipal employees were still East Chicago citizens, but now you don't necessarily need to live in the same city you work as either like a firefighter or a police officer. So it now adds like this new element of vulnerability. Like if you work in East Chicago but don't live in East Chicago, your power of a vote or endorsement doesn't really have the same weight as an East Chicago resident, because you can't simply just like vote them out. You have to now make like these injustices known and hope that like residents side with you. So sorry, that's like the very long like parallel answer. But East Chicago's always been a political community. I mean, for better or for worse. I'm sure people across the state have varying opinions on that. And for many ways, it hasn't looked any different for the past 100 years. In that it's small, normally like very cliquish groups of friends, neighbors, coworkers that have organized over some issue. Whether it's, I think one of the first political acts I can think of is when I believe it was the Benito Juarez Society protest the discrimination against Mexicans at movie theaters in the harbor. And they and through that protest were now able to sit with other residents of East Chicago. They weren't segregated in the theater anymore, as long as they wore a button saying they were from like the Benito Juarez Society. And to this day, I mean, Latino and neighborhood organizations in East Chicago continue to meet, but these are not like mass meetings of hundreds of people. They're a dozen people sitting around at breakfast each week talking about what's really upset them. I think it highlights, hearing about these meetings, it really highlights like how local politics is. Like, yeah, sure, there's going to be like these larger issues like the firefighter debate that just settled in court last week, that just finally resolved itself in court last week, but also like issues like regular garbage pickup, not having a working street light, needing more accessible sidewalks that you can go from your home to the grocery store and back without having to like wheelchair yourself through the street. Like these small community issues, I think, are still really prevalent and important. That's, I'm sure, not just in Chicago, but everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere throughout the state. So I don't know, is there anything else that you could tell us about, it sounds like a lot of your research is based on like activism in organizations. And so at the Benito Juarez Society, give us a date on that and talk to a little bit about some of those organizations that existed.
Yeah, Benito Juarez Society is one of the 3 later organizations that merged into the Mutual Aid Society of the Union Benefica Mexicana, UBM, in 1956. And Benito Juarez Society, named for the Mexican president at the time, is an important, primarily like middle-class organization that allows them, when they show up in the 1920s, or when they organize in the 1920s, to retain connections to Mexico. I would add very quick, sorry, like one of those afterthoughts always, right? One of the interesting bits about the Concerned Lands organization, actually, to jump back a little, is that their first petition that they submit to the city council, which the city council doesn't have, but the Land Times reprinted, which is another very important bit of the Land Times. Like they reprinted these things. Government transparency then was a huge issue, as sure as many people view it as now. The Land Times reprinted. Their first action was against ghost payrolling. One of their concerns was that, hey, these people who have been here 30 years probably don't even work anymore, and they're just part of this scam where someone has their name down, that person collects a check, they give them a couple bucks for like letting them use their name, and that whoever signed them up is pocketing the rest of the salary. So I think that's super interesting too, to see And one of the points of my work is like looking through the civil rights activism, not just as a sort of anti-discrimination movements, like a lot of civil rights activism is seen, but an appeal for good government. So like not anti-corrupt, but also like an appeal for good and proper, like small d democracy.
So I see that there's a question, and you mentioned the Latin Times, and somebody asks about, are there any other Latino publications other than the Latin Times in Northwest Indiana? So preface, so the Latin Times was started in the 1950s through a press that was owned by the Figueroa family. And so Francisco and Consuelo Figueroa in the 1920s they owned a printing press that started the first Spanish language newspaper in the 1920s called El Amigo del Hogar, Friend of the Home. And that ceased sometimes in the early 30s, but then in the 1950s, the Sons pick it up. And this newspaper is both in English and in Spanish. And Emiliano and I, prior to going live with everything, we're just kind of geeking out about how spectacular this newspaper is, because it's written in the voice of the people of the community. And when comparing it to mainstream newspapers, you see a perspective that you'll never see in newspapers. So reflecting on the Latin Times, what are some of your, Emiliano, what are some of your favorite things about the Latin Times?
Yeah, one is its durability. The fact to be a very, at times, conflicting paper, right? Like it's very anti-machine politics, very pro-Latino, Latina, but then also like, well, how do we rectify the fact that like now we have like Latinos that are part of the political machine? Do we praise them like we did when they were running for office? Do we criticize them? And Latin Times, the staff does land on the side of like, no, we have to criticize and hold them accountable. We're for good government. We need to be taken seriously. So that's one of my favorite things. I also really like the Tilly. My name is Tilly, especially after finding
the anonymous
out that,
column.
Yeah, this anonymous gossip column from this supposed woman named Tilly.
It was good gossip. It wasn't bad gossip. It was like, oh, so word on the street is that we hear that, Laura Gonzalez just got accepted into college. It wasn't anything malicious, but it was good sort of gossip. But
there was some good chisme in there.
Yeah, there was some good chisme in there. Yeah, there was. Somebody told me who the identity of Tilly was, and I forgot. But I think with respect to the Latin Times and the Figueroa family, I will keep that to myself. Do we have any questions from the audience? Anybody? We've got a good number of attendees. Oh, there are some too. Let me take a look. All right. Is the Latin Times archived anywhere? Yes, it is on microfilm currently. If you are a student at through IU or any of their networks, you can, their microfilms are digitized.
Yes, and if you're local to the Chicago, Northwest Indiana region, the Chicago Library in the Harbor neighborhood, the main branch, does have some of the issues. It's not a full run by any means. And then I see this question too about like the Latino publications. There were other like Latino publications.
Yeah.
I would just add like some of them didn't last very long. There was one ran by this guy, Mark Antonio Diaz Infante, out of East Chicago, that lasted all of 9 issues. The English language newspaper, the Calumet News, Daily Calumet News, yeah.
I think it's the Daily Calumet News. It sounds familiar, but yes, go ahead.
Tries to start a Spanish branch of their paper, and that lasts, I believe, 2 months.
Wow.
So one of the important bits about Latin Times, and why I think a lot of people who write about like Latinos and Latinas in Northwest Indiana or in Indiana utilizes, just because the consistency and the fact that it stayed around.
And criticize they did. And so it's just, again, such a great things that I have found in there I've never found anywhere else. And so I am very thankful for the Latin Times. The Indiana Historical Society does have the physical copies, and they can be made available upon request here in the Indiana Historical Society is located in downtown Indianapolis. So do we have any other questions? We talked a lot about, and so I would assume that a lot of our attendees are not from Northwest Indiana. You mentioned Mayor Pastrick a lot Bob Patrick. Can you talk a little bit more about why is he significant? Tell us about Bob.
Yeah, I mean, Mayor Patrick was the longest serving mayor in East Chicago, 1972 to, gosh, what would that have been, 2003, 2004. And one of his, there's quite a few claim to fames, right? One of the important bits being is how active Northwest Indiana politicians were in legalizing gambling in the state. We do have to keep in mind, like, gambling's relatively like new as a legal enterprise in the state, and Patrick's role in coordinating with mayors in like Hammond and Gary in particular to get this happen as sort of their solution to deindustrialization, right? Like, we don't have now all of the tax base that we once had through the manufacturing economy. Now let's turn to like the service economy. And then I mean, if you're a lifelong Hoosier, you've probably heard of like King of Steel Town and this very like infamous, nefarious side of Bob Patrick, as 1989 U.S. News and Weekly reported, like, the head of the last city machine in America. And he really ran the community like old style political machine. I think one of the big differences is, like, one, he gets overshadowed a lot because there's this guy, Richard Daley, just over state line. And then two, like, how different people of like Daley and Patrick were from like these old boss Tweed figures. I mean, these were college educated, smooth operators that had these degrees, that were members of this community. In the case of Patrick, he's the first East Chicagoan to become mayor of East Chicago. Like, most of the other ones were from other places throughout the Midwest, a lot of Ohio and Michigan folks that served as mayors. I mean, in my dissertation, it's called Building a Latino Machine. So I grapple with corruption, machine politics, and the credit I give Mayor Patrick is holding together a political machine is not easy. And he held together essentially an ethnic European machine for 30 years in a city where ethnic Europeans were the minority after 1970. And he does this through political negotiations and like the greatest balancing act of, well, you're going to have people that don't like you, that are anti-machine and appeal for good government, how to minimize that by offering as many opportunities as possible to Latinos, and Black residents in the community, and trying to make sure as many people stay happy as possible.
And we have another question. So somebody said that they plan on purchasing your book. What is the name of your book? And when will that be out? And also, did you mention Mayor Nicosia? Yes, take a sip of water before you answer that. Before we lean into that question.
So the book right now is the dissertation. And I will definitely spend all of next year, I already foresee that, getting the dissertation ready for a manuscript. And I hope 2-3 years down the road, Building a Latino Machine is, one of those books that you could pick up at O'Hare on your flight or whatever. And I do mention Mayor Nicosia. I think Nicosia has such an important role in city politics. Nicosia is the first mayor to really utilize a Latino vote, and that helps him essentially beat Mayor Jaros. I mean, Nicosia is carried in the sixth district. Every precinct where ethnic Mexicans and Puerto Ricans were a majority, Nicosia won hands down. And he really popularizes, like, even before, this is all coming from like the after Viva Kennedy bit, like this national idea of like using Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans in politics. Nicosia's like printing buttons that say Viva Nicosia. He does run afoul of this though through that walkout. There's a protest on his yard in front of his house. In front of his house, yeah. Him and his wife come pulling up to a crowd of what they described for the newspapers as angry protesters who wanted him to remove Barron from the school system. They wanted him to fire him. And he allegedly hits a teenage photographer and busts his lip, calls the protesters pigs, has cops force them off his property. I mean, and by no surprise, he decides not to run for election in 72. I mean, the story gets carried, like the story of him punching that teenage photographer gets carried not only throughout the region, Indianapolis Star carries it, New York Times carries it, LA Times carries it. Nicosia made news coast to coast for hitting this kid.
Wow.
And
He
yeah,
really started off, Nicosia started off on a good foot because he was following the fallout of Urban Renewal Project #1 after almost a solid decade of really no progress of building anything. And Nicosia starts to build what is now, or what was called the CalView apartments. And so in terms of urban renewal, which I think are now slated for, demolition.
Yes,
actually, and that was in the Block and Pensy neighborhood. We have Laura, who says thanks for our work. She's tuning in from Laredo, Texas, but she works for the Whiting Public Library. So hi, Laura. Thanks for.
Hi, Laura. Nice to see you again. I believe you came to the Newberry one a few months back. So wonderful to see you again.
So I'm gonna check in. Do we? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah. It looked like Michael has a follow-up about relationship with industry in Nicosia. Seemed like a good one. East Chicago, particularly like those late 60s, I'd say is like almost a gilded bit. Like East Chicago is heading for fiscal crisis, and it does very quickly in the 70s because of like some exorbitant spending that's done by Nicosia and continued by Pastrick. Again, like a Washington Elementary is slated to be built. Nicosia begins that project, which is finalized under Pastrick once he becomes mayor, at $14 million. And there's this report, the Nicholson report, that was issued sort of condemning this whole project for like its exorbitant cost and that this is going to lead to ruin. And the fun bit about the Nicholson report is that the city requested the report to be done and then never actually issued the report in its entirety. So the copy I've seen that they did release is like the most, there's probably no professional word other than like jank. Like it goes from on the corner, page 1, then you flip it over, instead of seeing page 2 like we would expect, you see like page 7.
So do you think it was redacted?
Well, redacted would have been the nice thing, right? Like to like Sharpie through the bits you didn't want, but like skipping 6 entire pages and just like bits and pieces. Like it was so piecemeal of a report that I would love to find the entire thing.
So do you think we have to wait like another 20 some years for like that 72-year privacy thing to be up before we think we can see this whole report?
I don't think the entire report exists anymore. I would not be surprised if the city got rid of that one. It's always surprising what cities decide to keep and what they don't. For example, like the Walker report I wrote about, which East Chicago hires a Chicago consulting engineer. It's like, well, people, and this is in the 1920s, people don't want to live in East Chicago. Why don't they want to live in East Chicago? So the Chicago consulting engineer comes in, interviews 10,000 workers, and not overwhelmingly, a fourth of the workers say, well, we don't want to live in East Chicago because there's too many Mexicans and there's too many Black people. Straight up saying like, we don't want to live there because of like these two demographics. And that report just existed in the library. Like it was just on the shelf. I found one day looking for something else and I read through that thing. It's like, this is something most cities get rid of at this point. Like I'm so happy East Chicago didn't. But if I haven't found it yet, I'm still looking for the Nicholson one. Fingers crossed.
I'll light a candle for you.
Yeah.
So another question that we have is, what was the biggest issues facing the political machine, and what was its lasting impact?
Yeah, so there's a few. I think one of the biggest issues facing political machine, particularly like in the context of deindustrialization, is that as these people can no longer work their manufacturing jobs, they turn to the machine. They've grown up and they've come of age in a system that is predicated on rewards. I vote for you. I put your sign with like your huge sign in my yard on a busy intersection every election season. I'm owed something. And then because of deindustrialization, because of a shrinking municipal budget, you can't really help everyone that comes to your door. Like East Chicago couldn't just hire now all these former steel workers. So that creates one issue where you have people, who are arguing that this machine like straight up saying it in the Times, in editorials, this machine no longer helps us. It's time to build our own. So instead of seeing like the issue as like machine, it's like no, it's now time we have our own that works for us. But I also think there's like issues of respectability and like the idea of like machine not always being negative, like connotated negatively. Like that's something of the progressive era. Like it wasn't really too later of the progressive era where these activists in the 1920s are really connotating machine as corrupt and corrupt as bad. So then when you get like people like the US News Weekly, Indiana Business Magazine calling East Chicago a political machine, it creates an image problem. Not many people will take pride in being politically active, but sort of associated with something negative like a political machine, not so much. And then of course, like the whole 2003 issue with absentee ballots in East Chicago, and I mean federal crackdowns, and you have people being convicted left and right. I mean, Lake County for some reason has hid very well under the national spotlight because of Cook County, but it's 3.5 times more elected officials that have faced these charges, that just in the 21st century.
Federal. Yes. Complicated question. So we don't have any questions left that I see, but I'm going to ask a question. Do you feel like in some sense that the political machine still exists? What do you think would that look like? Or how does that look like?
Yeah, so I do. I do think a political machine still exists. I think that a lot of the changing character, and this is a question that's like in the scholarship as well. In 70s, you have this edited volume, Bosses in America, which are a collection of historians and political scientists that are asking the same question, like, is there still a political machine in the 70s? And they sort of answer like, yeah, probably. But maybe because of like the changing demographics and the old school machine's unwillingness to incorporate those changing demographics, the machine will die out. And we sort of seen, and part of my dissertation, soon to be like 2-3 years down the road book, point is like changing demographics doesn't fix a machine mentality. Like if this is how new demographics are assimilated or incorporated, integrated, whatever word you want to use, into a system, this is what they know. So, and I think, for instance, like that's remained the same. I mean, a lot of the people who grew up in this Pastrick era, like dominated political machine, are the people who are elected in office now. And really what you have to change is sort of like, how do you do patronage? Like, how do you have patronage in a 21st century like bit where you can't just say like, oh, you're my cousin, you're hired. You have to now navigate through like these civil service exams, and now the changing notion of like seniority that occurs in the 70s. And I think because of that, it's been complicated, but still not as like, I don't want to phrase that, not as dead, to ramble on that bit. Like there's, whether it be sort of the advantages given to an incumbent, money in politics, sort of like the name recognition that surrounds it, like you could still build political machines, and we might call them now like political dynasties, right? And those could be whether local, federal, local, state, federal level, like dynasties. Yeah, all that's rambled on. Like I'm still writing that conclusion bit, so I'll have an answer for you in a few years, I'm sure.
Is there a way that people can connect and follow your work? Are you available? Do you tweet regularly on social media? I mean, on Twitter, what is the best way to kind of follow your work?
Yeah, so I'm trying to get better about the tweeting. I do apologize, like to anyone who follows me on there. Like I'm dissertating right now and finishing up to graduate in June with the PhD. So the tweets haven't came through as quickly as I'd like, but it's at NWI Historian on Twitter. And I do always make sure to share anything I publish, like goes up there immediately. If I'm in the archive and find something interesting, cool, I definitely like to post that and just sort of like rant and ramble a bit about those documents or anything I find in there.
I think we have time for one more question if our audience has anything that they would like to ask. Any burning questions? You can stay anonymous. None. Okay. Do you want to leave us on some lasting thoughts?
Yeah, I think lasting thoughts for just like the project overall has really been like it's been so interesting to see sort of what begins as an appeal for good government by returning veterans of World War II, in the case of like my overall project. Um, this appeal for a good government becoming essentially many saying like if you can't beat the political machine you join them. And I think it gives like this very
Mhm.
in my eyes when I'm reading through this like pessimistic look for like small d democracy too, like how even especially in communities like East Chicago and Northwest Indiana, the industrial core in general, these legacies of corruption have created like empathetic, you don't lose voters to another party, we've lost like voters to the couch. My maternal grandfather, who I do write about my conclusion because he sticks with me constantly on this, and what he would do and say, just being like, he never voted. He was a lifelong East Chicagoan who voted once when he was first able to at 21 back then, and then never did again because he had this mentality that things never were going to change through electoral politics. And he had seen it his entire life, new people coming in, old people going out, and the system itself never changing. And I think that's like been the most pessimistic bit of my project, that I'm hoping to have a brighter, more optimistic answer when the dissertation does become a book.
Oh, anonymous. Let's see. Somebody says, as a former resident of Northwest Indiana, Indiana Harbor, and because it's dinner time, I can remember those long, long lines at Taco Real. Nothing but great memories. Yes, Taco Real. I'm so glad they still exist.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if anybody else remembers PH Bakery on Pulaski, that's my dad's side of the family. So we've got some I've got some long roots to Northwest Indiana.
It's a great little community, wonderful history.
Yeah, and the carnivals, old. Yep, I think
Yes,
I went to some of those when I was little. So Our Lady of Guadalupe Church has been in Indiana Harbor since 1926. And I feel like if you're a Catholic and Mexican and you have roots to Northwest Indiana, Our Lady of Guadalupe Church is your family church. And so it's got that place was really amazing. It served as a kind of like a community center, fed people during the Depression, organized people during the 60s, really kept the community together. And it still exists today on Deodore Street. So Nathan, why do you think there's so little in the historical literature about Latinx community in Northwest Indiana, especially since it has had the densest community in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think
that's a loaded question. That's a loaded question.
That's a loaded question.
You and I probably have some kind of words, but you can go first. Thanks, Nathan. Nathan, just throwing in there right last minute.
He knew we could fill some time with that question for sure. And I think there's so little just because of how bi-coastal, whether it's like we want to call it Latinx history, Latino history, whatever, is predominantly focused on the Southwest, focused on New York, Florida. And if you do talk about Midwestern communities, you really only talk about Chicago for some reason, despite like new scholarship like Antonio Ramirez at Elgin showing like most Latinos and Latinas don't even live in Chicago proper. They live in the burbs. Like, I think there's just so little because the Southwest and those other areas, whether it's Florida and New York, have such a large demographic already that's where a lot of the attention is placed. Like, oh, well, the largest ones are here. And that in many ways like marginalizes these stories then from places where they're still very important. I mean, Chicago,
throughout the Midwest, it's like we're flyover country, but also flyover history, right? And I think I really love that 1931 Paul Schuster Taylor Mexican Labor in the United States report. I think it's absolutely fabulous, and it goes all the way to Pennsylvania, and then it covers the Midwest, right? And so. Again, that's a really great question, Nathan. And I think Emiliano and I are on our personal quest to change that narrative, as well as many other great scholars and historians. So I think there's more to come, right? So
absolutely. Yeah, I probably got another decade in me of writing a book.
Yeah. Okay, we got some couple more questions. Let me take a look. All right. Ethan. Oh yeah, he asked the questions in the Q&A section as well as the public section. So, all right. So I don't know. Yeah, we can. All right. So I really want to thank you for everybody for sticking around for this long, listening to our talk. I know that this is recorded and it'll be available on the Indiana Historical Society's YouTube channel in quite some time. I don't want to make any promises I can't keep. And so I wanted to have John Kennedy here close us out. So thank you all for everybody for attending. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. Yeah, thank you, Nicole.
Yeah, this was a wonderful discussion. I certainly learned so much, especially about Northern Indiana. And just really, like I said, just the whole conversation where we're talking about like the politics, how things changed. Really, and I know this seems like a weird takeaway. I loved how they had to put in that guardrail where at first I thought it was a metaphor that you were saying. And it was sort of like, oh no, there's a metaphorical guardrail. Okay, some new rule. And then we see the picture and it's a physical guardrail. And yeah, it's just really wonderful time. Thank you to our guest, Emiliano Aguilar. Thank you for coming on our show. And if you didn't see the link in the chat to his upcoming or to his book, you'll be getting it in an email tomorrow morning. And thank you, Nicole, for being a wonderful moderator. Thank you for keeping the conversation going. And I think we all really learned something. And so as Nicole said, we've got some great events coming up at the Indiana Historical Society, and you can learn more about these events at www.indianahistory.org. Our next program is going to be on May 12th, and it's going to be with Susan Sutton, where we look at the Hoosier Motorist Collection. We will post this conversation to the IHS YouTube channel and our website in the upcoming weeks. In the meantime, if you'd like to revisit any of our previous free programs, you can check out the History Happy Hour playlist on YouTube or at the link at in the chat. If you missed your chance to donate or like to make a further gift to support the Indiana Historical Society, please visit indianahistory.org/contribute/donate. Your donation will allow us to continue to share Hoosier stories. You will get an email from us tomorrow morning with the link to Emiliano's book, but also with a brief survey. This survey will let us know what you thought about our program, and also we can make any recommendations for how we can improve this program. I want to thank you all again, and thank you to all our wonderful guests for joining us tonight, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. All right, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.